Well, we're picking up right where we left off last week. I've been working on this same 12 feet of track now for like 6 weeks.
Something like that. It's been quite a project.
That's the Central Pacific built 10 miles of track in one day when they were building the Transcontinental Railroad. I work a little slower, I guess.
Just a bit. We don't have an entire crew, though.
Yeah, they had 20,000 people, and it's just me building this. Anyway, last week I got all of the pieces for the number 6 switch. Again, to pick up the switch here is the separation between the line that runs over to the switching yard and the line that runs over to the turntable. Essentially, this whole area of the railroad here is the locomotive shop.
Yeah.
And when I was first envisioning this was the thing I wanted to build the most, was the locomotive shop. So really the heart of the whole railroad is this locomotive shop. And it's a giant area. It's just at 1/20th scale. You can't do much.
Right. It takes up a lot of space.
Everything in here is huge, including the trains. Anyway, we're back this week spiking the rail and spiking down the switch and getting all of the components of the switch working. I'm using this 3-point Llagas Creek track gauge. It's always better to have a 3-point gauge, a 2-point gauge like the plastic ones there, the micro-engineering ones. While they're really handy to just sort of hold things in place, it's possible for them to get a little bit skew in there, whereas a metal 3-point gauge can't possibly twist and is 100% accurate. So where I'm actually spiking, I want to use the 3-point track gauge. I've been using these spike driving pliers here for like 30 years. I think I got them from Walther's. I've seen them in the microengineering catalog too, but this is the great way to put in spikes. It's just a pair of needle nose pliers, but it's got these 2 little grooves carved in there, one horizontal, one vertical, and they very neatly grip the spike so it can't twist. I found that it's real easy to not have the spike quite locked in there when you're trying to push it in, and it just twists and goes anywhere other than where you want it. But if you've got it locked into those little grooves, it's 100% accurate. It just goes straight in. And then if they get a little bit off, you can twist them into place, and then they tend to not go all the way in, so then you have to come back with the tip of the pliers and push them in place. So with everything neatly spiked into place, we're ready for the finishing bits and pieces, the guardrails and the ever important points and throw bar. Now, as I mentioned before, I wasn't able to spike in the area where the guardrails go. This is the guardrail, and there's one on each stock rail opposite the frog, and they hold the back of the wheel up against the stock rail so that the wheel truck can't pick the frog and go down the wrong route on the frog. On a prototype railroad, the tie plate is usually a custom-made plate just cut out of a sheet of metal. Also notice that the guardrail is bolted to the stock rail. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to have my guardrail spiked in place, not bolted to the stock rail. As I've mentioned before, I'm using Llagas Creek castings for the frog and the points. Llagas Creek also makes a guardrail that has the bolt heads cast in there. It's pretty nice looking, but I'm opting to just simply fabricate my own guardrails out of a bit of rail. Notice also that there has to be just a very, very slight bend at both ends of the guardrail to catch the flange and guide it neatly down into the flangeway. So I've placed my guardrail in the vise and just barely tweaked that over just a little bit. In this case, I'm not going to have a tie plate on the inside. I'm just going to directly spike the guardrail down to the ties, but on the outside of the stock rail, I want to have a tie plate there, and a tie plate with two spikes in it rather than just one, which again would be prototype practice at the guardrail. So I'm taking some of my tie plate castings and just snipping them off so that they only go up under the stock rail but don't extend beyond the inside of the stock rail. And then I can spike those in underneath the stock rail and allow the guardrail to rest directly on the tie and spike that in place. Now, the tricky thing here is figuring out the spacing in the space between the guardrail and the stock rail. Normally, you'd use an NMRA standards gauge, and it's got a little flange that drops in there and sets the spacing for you. But in large scale, NMRA has actually published 3 different standards for this because there's so much variation in the equipment. Some of the equipment has very thick wheels, some of it has very thin wheels, some of them have really tall flanges, some of them don't. And so figuring out exactly the spacing here on the guardrail. So my first attempt here, and it's what I've used on other switches in the switching yard, and it seemed to work successfully, was to put a spike down between the guardrail and the stock rail. I could put one facing one way and then the next one facing the other way, and so on, and that would lock the guardrail in place because it's spiked inside here, and it also locks the stock rail in place. So that seemed to be the logical choice. It makes for a fairly wide space here though, and when I tried running a locomotive through here, while it ran forward through the switch just fine, oddly enough, coming backward through here, the flange was climbing up on the edge of the frog. It wasn't derailing the train, but you could actually see the wheel climb up and then drop back down. So the spacing needs to be much tighter than that. You can see here on prototype drawings that the guardrail is supposed to be right up against the back of the wheel on one side and right up against the stock rail on the other side. Very little play in this system at all. The problem that we have in large scale is these wheels are all different sizes and the flanges are all different sizes. So exactly what can you do? What is going to work with all of your equipment? And that just sort of requires a lot of testing. So what I ended up doing was pulling out the guardrails and resetting them just like in the picture here, so that the foot of the rail is right up and touching the foot of the other rail. And that means in order to spike it in place, the foot of the rail has to have holes drilled in it to run a spike down through there, just like we did with the points, and for the exact same reason, that if it's only spiked on one side, it will come loose. And so the only way to deal with that is to drill the rail and then put your spike down through that on the inside. And now to test it, I'm taking my reefer and dragging it back and forth through the frog here. I'm running that through both routes to double check to make sure I'm not going to get any derailments here at the frog. Everything seems to be working just fine. Okay, on to the points then. The points, I think, are the trickiest thing to get set up just right. These are the points, these 2 blades. In Great Britain, they're called the blades. These are Llagas Creek castings, and they connect to the closure rails with these rail joiners. They have to have a flexible joint right here because they're going to move back and forth, and this rail joiner acts as almost a hinge. Well, definitely a hinge, but it barely moves at all. So it's simple to just use a rail joiner. It's really, really critical that these not be allowed to slide up and down along the rails. They have to fit super tight, otherwise your points can drift away from your closure rails. You don't want that. Just inside the ends of the points is the switch rod. In this case, it's a piece of circuit board material with the foil side down and the fiberglass side up. As I mentioned before, this was salvaged from an old Llagas Creek switch, and so this switch rod was already in place when I removed it from that switch, and it's riveted to the circuit board material, and the rivet goes all the way through and is soldered to the foil side, and as the foil side is continuous all the way across, I'm going to have to break that copper foil, otherwise the points are shorted out. Again, if I were electrically connecting the points and frog and everything as all one circuit, that would be fine. But in this case, I can't do that. I'm using an isolated frog, so I'm going to have to cut through that foil backing on the switch rod. So I just used a cutoff wheel on my Dremel and very lightly cut through that foil. It's very, very thin. It cut through easily. The switch rod also has this stud soldered to it for mounting a ground throw. I'm not going to be using a ground throw. I'm going to be using a Llagas Creek switch stand. So I cut this away, and I'm going to use a smaller pin further out in order to mount my switch stand. Now, all along the area where the points move are point slide rail braces, also called chairs. These outer braces that are put on the prototype railroad, these are there to keep the rails from being pushed out of gauge by the force of the points closing. And I want to duplicate that, not so much for functionality, but just for appearance. They look great. Some time ago, I purchased a set of these Llagas Creek point slide rail braces that are cast out of like a nickel or something. They're very indestructible. But I just bought one set and then made a mold off of those so that I could cast up as many as I wanted, because I had quite a few switches I wanted to lay with these, and I just wanted to cast my own. Now, one of the significant problems you have when you're constructing your own switch is that this whole area where the points are moving back and forth, you cannot spike that on the inside. You can only spike that on the outside. On the inside, you've got the points moving in and out and up against the stock rail, so you can't have any obstructions in there. It all has to be open. Also, the points are sliding back and forth across the point slide rail braces. Those being metal, of course, that means that the points are electrically connected to the stock rail. And this is why I had to go to an isolated frog design and cut through the foil backing on the switch rod so that the points can be electrically isolated from each other, as each one is in contact with the stock rail at all times through the point slide rail braces. I certainly wouldn't count on this to provide power to the points and the closure rails, and that's why I've also soldered jumper wires to the bottom of the closure rails that go down to the main track bus, so that this is actually picking up power from several different locations, but the main connection point are the jumper wires that are connected to the closure rails. The other consideration here is that I can't spike this the stock rails here where the points are. I can't have anything down in the gap between the points or the stock rail. And on the outside, I've got the rail braces there that'll sort of keep the rail from moving out of gauge outward, but they don't really provide any actual support holding the stock rail in gauge. And so what I want to do is put one spike right in the middle of this whole thing to help lock the gauge in place so that it can't move out of gauge. And since, again, I can't have a spike to the inside, what I'm going to do is drill a hole down through the foot of the rail and then put that one spike down through that hole and into the tie, therefore locking the gauge of the stock rail. Unfortunately, that means I can't put my chair, my point slide rail brace in there because, well, there's a spike going down through. I can't slide anything under the rail. Moreover, I want to cover that whole thing up and make it look like there's a point slide rail brace. So what I did is I cut off just the very end of that, just the chair part, and then carved that out with an engraving tool here, taking it down so that it would neatly fit over that spike. I did that with both of the stock rails, and you can see that the downside is now I don't have a slide, a metal slide under the points opposite where I had to cut the slide off. So what I'm going to do is just take 2 of those slides and cut those away and just glue those in place, since there's no way to spike them there. And let's see if the points are working, and in fact they are. There's always some minor adjustments to make here. Of course, the divergent line is always going to be the trickiest. The tangent wants to work quite well, as the points are tucking up neatly into that little kink that I put in the stock rail. But the divergent is just a little trickier to get to close tightly. I don't have a switch stand in place yet, so I can't actually lock the points in place, but I can test it just by rolling things through here with the points just kind of on the loose, if you will. Once the switch stand is in place, then I'll be able to throw the switch stand, which should lock the points in place, and at that point everything should work perfectly. Everything's working fine here on the tangent line. Little tick there on the divergent line, but that's just because the points aren't really locked in place. Now, as I mentioned before, the switch rod was originally designed to work with a ground throw, and I'm converting that now to work with a Llagas Creek switch stand. So I've had to cut off that heavier pin where the ground throw connected, and I've drilled through and put a smaller pin that goes up through this extension on the throw rod that goes all the way over to the switch stand. And I've put a small music wire pin through here, and then I soldered that in place to make sure it wasn't going to move or fall out. So at this point, I'm pretty sure the switch actually works. And what remains to be done on the switch is simply setting the switch stand in place.
Right.
But because all of the switch stands around here have working lanterns, then that means rigging the wiring to the switch stand. So we have to set up the light before I can actually set the switch stand. And then I always get a little nervous when it comes to setting the switch stand, because you get one shot at that, and if I have to take it up and redo it, it never sits right. The holes, you can't reuse the holes in the ties.
Oh my.
Anyway, we hope that you're going to want to follow along with that. And so if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe. Doesn't cost anything, doesn't hurt anything, and it helps us out. And in the long run, it helps you out because it helps the algorithm find you. And the easy way to do that is click the blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday.
Right?
See ya.
We'll see ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.